Well, it's lovely to be with you guys this morning. As Alice said, my name is Paul. I'm one of the pastors here. And we are kicking off a new series in the book of Hebrews. Hopefully we'll be more excited by the end. But we are really excited for this series. We've called this series Fix Your Eyes, a journey through Hebrews. We are looking all about Jesus over the course of this series. It's going to be a 7-parter, and we're not going to go through verse by verse because for those of us in the room who have read Hebrews before, you know it's pretty meaty, and that would probably take us the next 7 years. So we are going to go through the whole of Hebrews, but looking through the lens of the titles of Jesus, and it will begin to make more sense as we go along, hopefully. And so we're going to look through those lenses, we're going to dive in, and we're going to unpack Hebrews. We're going to, across the course of the series, we're going to jump into the Old Testament a little bit, to help us understand what the author of Hebrews is talking about. Now, the invitation as we do this series is for us to fix our eyes more fully on Jesus, that we would fall more in love with the person of Jesus by the end of this series. It's not just that we would know a bit more about one of the books of the Bible. It's not that we would just know a little bit more about the context that it was written and things like that. It's that we would come to know Jesus more, that we would see him for who he really is, and that we would fall more in love with him. Now, as I said, we're going into the book of Hebrews. I wonder if some of you maybe felt how I felt when we said we were going to do this a few months ago. And I was like, not sure the last time I read Hebrews. Because I don't know if you would be like me. Historically, I found it quite a daunting book. I've read it, and if I'm totally honest, I've been like, I don't really understand what's going on here. I don't quite know why you're talking about these different things. I don't quite understand the context that you're making. And generally, as I chat to different people, that I don't think I'm totally alone in that. Okay, maybe in this room I am, but when I go next week to preach to the north and the west, I know that I won't be alone. But you guys, the holy bunch, as we kick off. But my hope today, as I kick off this series, and it sounds like you guys will be able to help me out and just heckle as we go, is to give us an overview of the book of Hebrews, to hopefully make it make a little bit more sense, so that over these next 7 weeks, we feel better equipped to understand what the author of Hebrews is getting at. And hopefully, and we would love for you to read Hebrews along with us, that then in your times with Jesus during the week when you're reading Hebrews, you'll be like, I get it. I get what the author's doing here. Well, I see how Jesus is amazing, and I see what the ask of me is. So today I'm going to give us a bit of an overview, and then I'm going to look at the first title that we're doing, which is Jesus is King. And it's really this idea that Jesus is king over all. He is the King of kings. He is superior to all things. And I don't know about you, but I just loved that worship set. We hadn't communicated beforehand, but my word, just every song I was like, yes, this is what I'm talking about today. And that song, There Is a King, that one we did in the middle, my word, it's just the truth of the gospel, and in such a beautiful way. And that is what we're coming back to today, that Jesus is the King above all kings. So let's jump straight into a little bit of the overview of Hebrews. Now, normally at this point, if we were introducing a Bible book, I'd say, right, so it was written by this person to this group of people in this year roughly, and we know the context exactly. But the reality is we don't actually know who wrote this book. And over the course of church history, that has been a source of much frustration and much debate and much tension. Some of you in the room may well struggle with the book of Hebrews because you're like, we don't know who wrote it. And there are various debates as to, was it Paul? Was it Apollos? Was it Barnabas? Ultimately, we don't know. And the reality is that we have now in 2023, we just have to sit in the mystery. And I heard someone say on a podcast I was listening to, on a podcast called She Reads Truth, they said, we don't believe the mystery was a mistake. And, sometimes we just have to sit in the mystery. We have to sit in the unknown. But we don't know who wrote Hebrews. Now, we do find out, though, in chapter 2 that the author received the message of faith. So they came to faith, they learned about Jesus directly from the teachings of the apostles. So it says this in Hebrews 2, verse 3. How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. So this is someone who has spent time with the apostles, spent time with people who spent time with Jesus. So the author didn't directly spend time with Jesus, but we can know that the teachings that they bring are rooted and grounded in the teachings of the apostles. And so we have an unknown author. And then within that, we have an unknown audience. We don't know to whom it was written. But what does seem clear is that the author knows these people well and that he cares or she cares deeply for them. It's clear that the author assumes the audience have a thorough understanding of the Old Testament. Not just an overarching kind of understanding of maybe what's going on, but that the audience would have a detailed understanding of the story of God's people, and especially the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Now, I would say that this is why many of us find it confusing as we come and read Hebrews now, because the reality is for most of us in the West, in the 21st century, we don't always have the best grasp on the Old Testament and the Old Testament story. Now, I know some of us in the room will do, but I think as a broad statement, a lot of us as we follow Jesus, we know bits of the Old Testament, but we're not deeply rooted and grounded in it. And what that means when we come to read the book of Hebrews is that we miss some of the references that the author is making. We miss some of the nuances that they are making where the audience of the time would have instantly understood. Oh, you're referring to this. Oh, this is the point you're making. Because you've said that, we actually understand the subcontext, almost the unsaid message, because you're comparing to that thing. Where when we come and read it now, we go, oh, you've talked about angels. You've talked about Melchizedek. What? Some of you know. We'll get there. Not today. I think it's how you're dealing with that, aren't you, Alice? There we go, throw you under the bus. I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, don't worry, for those who haven't got that. But we read these moments and they just go over our head. And I think that's why for a number of us, we find it quite hard as we come to engage with Hebrews. But we have this audience who clearly know the scriptures, who clearly know the author, and it seems clear that this group of Christians, who are likely probably Jewish Christians because of their understanding of the Old Testament, are facing some form of persecution. We read about this in chapter 10, that they're facing persecution and imprisonment for their faith, and that some of these Christians have started walking away from their faith. They're just like, you know what, this is too hard. Or some of them have begun to just compromise their beliefs to go, you know what, we really like Jesus, but we just kind of want to make our life easy as we live in a society that doesn't follow him. So I'm just going to compromise this belief and I'm just going to mold this one to look a bit more like culture. And into that context, we have the book of Hebrews, which is a word of exhortation to these Jewish Christians, warning them to not give up on their faith. And what Hebrews does is it goes through lots of different aspects of who Jesus is. And it says he is superior to everything else. His new covenant, he is superior to anything that you've received in the past. Do not give up on him. Do not turn away from him. No matter what you are facing, he is worthy of our trust and our devotion. So even if you're facing persecution, even if you're facing imprisonment, do not turn away from Jesus. Yes, amen. So, within the book of Hebrews, we have 2 main themes that we can break down into largely within 2 parts. Now, of course, within these 2 parts, there's some overlap, and I think we'll have a slide that hopefully will bring this up. And so, the first theme that we have is that the author wants to elevate Jesus above everything else. And so we really see this in chapters 1 to 10. We're going to go through a breakdown of that in just a moment, again, to help us understand it more. But really, the author's intent here is to say Jesus is superior to anything that has gone before him. Everything that you have rooted your faith in, Jesus is superior to. He is the culmination of, and he is superior to. And therefore, he is worthy of our trust and devotion. And so what happens, especially in chapters 1 to 10, is we have this moment where the author says, Jesus is superior to this. So therefore, here's a warning. Jesus is superior to this, so do not turn away from him. Jesus is superior to this, so do not rebel against him. And that is the bulk of chapters 1 to 10. So that's the first theme. And then the second main theme is to remain faithful to Jesus and to follow the example of great people of faith before you, and to remain faithful to Jesus, especially in the face of persecution. We see this in the final chapters, in chapters 11 through to 13, but we also see these warnings and this exhortation throughout chapters 1 to 10, so there is this overlap. But these are the two main themes that we have within Hebrews. And then we have the overarching message of Hebrews. So what is really the author trying to get us to understand through some sometimes complex theology? It's that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. The book of Hebrews starts with this astonishing verse in verse 3. The Son, so this is Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. What you have in Jesus is the exact representation of God. You want to know what God is like? You look to Jesus. You want to know how God would treat the lowly and the outcast? You look to Jesus. You want to know how God would deal with your sin and your shame? You look to Jesus. Whatever you want to know about God, I could go on and on and on. The author is saying you look to Jesus because he is the exact representation of God. Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation. Jesus is fully God. The author is starting and putting Jesus in his rightful place. He's saying he is fully God. He is the King of all kings. He's the exact representation of God. So if we have him, we best not turn away from him. So right from the off, the book of Hebrews puts Jesus in his rightful place. And then the following 10 chapters are a more complex and theological explanation of the truth that Jesus is superior to everything. And it's in these chapters that I think those of us who are a bit less familiar with the Old Testament, it's really in these that we get a little bit stuck. So many of us will love Hebrews 11 and Hebrews 12, but Hebrews 6, 7, and 8, we're like, oh, I don't want to go there so much. And so hopefully across the course of this series, we are going to see that there is such richness in all of Hebrews for us to understand who Jesus is. And so to do that, I want to give a very quick overview of chapters 1 to 10 and what the author is doing and who the author is saying Jesus is superior to. Again, so that as you read along with us in your own times with Jesus, hopefully it will help you. This is just a high-level whistle-stop explanation. But what you'll see is that each area is contrasted against Jesus, and then there is a warning given in relation to that comparison. Again, I think there should be a slide that will hopefully help visualize this. So the first couple of chapters, the author contrasts Jesus to angels. Now, here in Wales, we might go, that's an odd place to start. What's the big deal with angels? Why would you start there? But you see, for the audience of the time, they would have been acutely aware of what the author was doing. Jewish tradition taught, based out of a verse in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2, that the first books of the Bible, that the Torah, were delivered to Moses by angels on Mount Sinai. So the very words of God, the scriptures, were handed to Moses by angels. And this is what Jewish tradition taught. And so the author is saying, if Jesus is superior to the angels, then his message of good news is superior to every other messenger that has gone before him. And therefore, if Jesus is superior to the angels, we best pay attention to him. Because the audience would have known that Jewish teaching was, we have to pay really careful attention to what Moses taught us. And so the author is saying, well, if the angels gave that to Moses, and we believe that we have to pay really careful attention to that, if Jesus is superior to the angels, we best pay careful attention to what he teaches. Next up, in the next couple of chapters, 3 and 4, we have Moses. The author goes on to say that Jesus is superior to the great faith leader Moses, the leader of God's people, who led them through the wilderness, who built the tabernacle of God's presence. And in contrast, the author is saying, well, Jesus is the ultimate leader of God's people. And in him, we have a builder not just of a tent, but of all creation. Hebrews talks about the fact that God created the world, created the universe with Jesus and through Jesus. The author in these chapters goes on to retell the story of Israel rebelling against Moses whilst in the wilderness and not being able to enter the promised land. And then he goes, well, the warning is, if Jesus is superior to Moses, well, then we best not rebel against his teaching and miss out on the chance of entering the new creation. The next few chapters, 5 to 7, we've got that Jesus is superior to the priests. Now, throughout the Old Testament, the priests mediated between God and his people. They made sacrifice for people's sins both daily and also yearly. However, because they themselves were flawed humans, they also had to make sacrifices for their own sins. And the point that's being made in these chapters is that Jesus is the ultimate priest king, that he is morally flawless. He is eternally available to his people. And so he is superior to any other mediator between man and God. And I mentioned this name, Melchizedek. He's quite a mysterious and confusing character, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But one of the points that is being made here is that all of the priests, the Levitical priests, were from the line of Aaron. Whereas the author of Hebrews says that Jesus is from the line and the order of Melchizedek. And this is this mysterious figure that we read about in the Old Testament. But ultimately, what the author is saying is that because of that, Jesus sits higher than all of the priests. I understand that for some of you, this is like, what on earth are you talking? It's going over your head. That's totally fine. As I said, in the following weeks, hopefully we'll dive into this a little bit more and you will get it. But it's really quite a profound point that is being made here about the lineage of the priesthood of Jesus. The warning, therefore, is that if you reject Jesus, you are rejecting one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God. And so the author is saying, Jesus is so available to you. He wants to mediate for you. And if you reject him, you are rejecting the chance of being reconciled to God. And then the final contrast that's made is of the sacrifice and covenant. The author shows us that Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all of the animal sacrifices that were given by the priests in the temple, superior to those sacrifices that had to be made constantly, made daily and yearly by those priests. Jesus offered his life once and for all. It was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world because he was morally flawless, the Lamb without blemish. Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, and it is the foundation of the new covenant where all sins are forgiven. And so the author warns the audience that if you walk away from this incredible offer, he's like, what are you doing? Why would you turn your back on this most gracious offer of forgiveness? Why would you go back into a mindset that would say, I need to sacrifice regularly for my sins when the offer of a once and for all sacrifice is being given to you? Now that is a whistle-stop tour of some kind of complex theology that refers a lot back to the Old Testament. And so I know for some of you in the room, you're just like, that has gone over my head. Maybe you're in the room and this is your first time in church in a really long time. And you're like, I was not expecting to hear about angels and Melchizedek. I didn't think I want to come back. Guys, let that just go over your head. That is totally fine. What I want you to really, really, really hear is that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. That he is the exact representation of God. And so if you're in the room and you're exploring faith, you're like, I just don't know what I believe. I think there's something out there. I want to find out what it is. Then look to Jesus because he is God incarnate. And if you look to him, you will see the Father. And what you will find is a God who loves you unconditionally and who wants you to walk in freedom. Now, hopefully that gives us a little bit of a snapshot of like, okay, that's what's going on in the book of Hebrews. And as I said, over the following weeks, we're going to dive into different parts of those chapters and explain them in a little bit more detail. What I want to do in the last few minutes with you is just go through this idea of Jesus is king over all. And what does that mean for us today? Because the reality is, for most of us in the room, we're probably not kind of too worried about comparing Jesus to angels. We're not at risk of going, Jesus, I know, but I just want to go back to the Levitical priests. That's how I really want to live my life. We're not in danger of that, but we are at danger of putting other things above Jesus. So let's jump back into the first few verses of Hebrews. Hebrews 1, verse 1 to 4. And it says this: in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed And I want you to just pay attention to some of the statements that are made about Jesus in the next few verses. Appointed heir of all things, and through whom he also made the universe. I love that. He just also made the universe through him. No big deal. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. This is our Jesus, the King of all kings, sitting down in majesty in the throne room of heaven. So he became, verse 4, as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. The book of Hebrews starts by elevating Jesus to his rightful position as King of all kings, the name above all names, the highest authority. This is the Jesus that we worship. This is the Jesus that we get out of bed on a Sunday morning to come and tell our kids about. I just nipped to the loo in the break and I heard our 3s and 4s having worship, singing Our God is a Great Big God. And I was like, oh, love our kids team who are there faithfully helping our young people know Jesus. Nora, my daughter, she's in 1s and 2s. Most Sundays she comes back singing Our God is a Great Big God. I took her to the supermarket last Sunday after church. She was walking around Tesco singing, Our God is a great big God. I was like, yes, yes. But it's amazing. This is the Jesus that we follow. Not some half power, not some nice moral teacher, but the King of all kings, the name above all names. Now, Hebrews 2 has this stark warning in it in verse 1. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. Remember the context that the author is writing into to a people facing persecution who are drifting away from their faith, who are turning their back on this amazing Jesus. This is people who have spent time with people who knew Jesus, who saw the miracles firsthand. This is people who are seeing the signs and wonders of the apostles, and yet even they will turn their back on Jesus when it gets hard. What for us are we in danger of putting higher than Jesus? What for us are the areas of life where we're going, oh, you know what, Jesus, I like your teaching, but I just want to make my life a little bit easier in this area. I just want to compromise slightly. I just want to fit in a little bit more in my workplace. I want to be in the world's ideals a little bit more. Where in our hearts and in our lives are we drifting away from the message of Jesus? It's so easily done. But the author is saying we must pay the most careful attention. We must come back time and time again to Jesus being the King of all kings, the ultimate sacrifice, the one who is superior to the angels, superior to Moses, superior to any other message of grace before him. We must pay careful attention to that, and we must not lose sight of it, because if we do, we will start to drift away. So what are the things that you look to for your identity, for your security, for your purpose? You know, in our culture, it might be money. It might be sexual freedom. It might be power. It might be individualism. It might be greed. It might just be comfort. You're like, all I want is a quiet, comfortable life. It might be more, if we were to put it into this context, and the author was writing to us now, he was saying, you know, you think that money is the thing that's going to bring you security in life. But the warning would be, well, no, money can come and go. It can disappear in an instant. If you want ultimate security, Jesus is the ultimate security. The one who knows you, who loves you, who was there before the world began and will be there when the new creation comes. He is unchanging and forever faithful. So that would be the message there. Maybe for you, you're actually like, no, I'm looking to my career. I'm looking for power and prestige to give me value and worth. But in the world we live, power can be taken away so quickly. You could be on the wrong side of a Twitter troll, or maybe people could find out how broken you really are. And you've got this veneer of confidence and this veneer of having it together, and you're like, oh, as long as they don't find out about this. And the author would say, well, no, but Jesus is the ultimate provider of worth and value. If you want to know your worth and value, look to the one who made you and who loves you, and will know every bit of your mess and your brokenness and still call you son or daughter. Because Jesus is king over all, he is worthy of our full devotion, of putting all other things in their rightful place. You know, some of the things that we look to in life, they're not bad things. They're just not the ultimate thing. Our allegiance to them has to be lower than our allegiance to Jesus. Now, just as I come into land, Hebrews is written to a people facing persecution. And, you know, many of us in the room won't have experienced persecution for our faith. But the cultural moment that we're living in, the landscape of our society is shifting. And there is a chance that we will face more persecution in the coming years as we live in a society that wants the kingdom without the king. There's a Vineyard maxim that says, come as you are, but don't stay as you are. It's this invitation into transformation, but we live in a cultural moment that's just saying, well, just come as you are and be totally fine with that. You don't need to change. There's nothing wrong with you. And actually, the heart of the Christian message is like, well, no, that there is. We are deeply broken. We are deeply sinful, but we are deeply loved. The reality is, we in the West can succumb to the subtle prosperity gospel, where we think, oh, okay, if I follow Jesus, you know, I don't think that I'm going to be giving a BMW. I don't think that I'm going to have this mansion, but I kind of think that my life will be pretty nice. I'll go to a church I like. I'll maybe get to meet up with some cool people and drink coffee in nice coffee shops, and we'll have nice dinners with people. And actually, life will just be generally good. And of course, some of these things are wonderful parts of following Jesus and doing life in community. But the reality of the Christian message, the reality is that following Jesus involves suffering and involves persecution. Jesus is clear in John 15. And he's speaking to his disciples. He says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. Now, who knows what the coming years will look like? Who knows what it will look like individually for us and corporately for us as a church? But what I do know is that Jesus is superior to anything else, and he is worthy of our full devotion and our full love, whatever the cost. And that the author of Hebrews would speak to us today and say, you know what, whatever comes, whatever faces us, however people will think of us, let us never drift away. Let us pay the most careful attention to who Jesus is, to the reality that he is the King above all kings, that he is the name above all names, that he is superior to all other things. And let us never drift away from that. Because if we begin to drift away from that, it is a dark and dangerous road. Where if we stay close to Jesus, even if we face persecution, we will be in the heart of the Lord. And we will one day get to be before him. And all will be made well. And as Alice Mee so beautifully put in one of her preachers, we will not feel shortchanged when we come face to face with Jesus.